All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, After Mythos, How Security and Risk Teams Take Action and Prove Resilience. My name is Olivia Bilodeau, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Bitsight, and I'm glad to be here with you today. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded, so we'll send it to you afterward. There's also a couple of tabs on your view that I want to make you aware of. You can use the chat, which is on the right side of your screen. Then there's a Docs tab with all the free resources you can download or use. There's also a Q&A, which is the third tab. This is where we'll receive all of your questions. All right. So I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. We're joined by Greg Keshian, Chief Product Officer at Bitsight, and Jake Goldcott, VP of Communications and Government Affairs at Bitsight. One quick note before we dive in. Throughout the webinar, you'll see a Talk to the Bitsight Expert button in the top right corner of your screen. You can use that to schedule a personalized session with our team in one click to discuss how these topics apply to your organization. All right, so with that, let's open the topic. So AI is changing the pace of vulnerability discovery and cyber exposure. For security teams, this creates a practical challenge. When the volume is growing, the response window is shrinking, and exposure may span your own environment, your vendors, your suppliers, and the broader digital ecosystem. So how do you decide what to fix first? That's the focus of today's discussion. It's not just a question of speed, it's a question of judgment and prioritization. Security teams need to understand which exposures are most likely to be exploited, which assets or vendors matter most to the business, and which actions will reduce the most material risk. Executives and boards need to understand the logic behind those decisions, especially when teams can't remediate everything at once. We'll move through this in a few key parts. Why risk-based response is now the mandate, what risk-based prioritization looks like in practice, how to think about third parties and supply chain, how to turn prioritization into a leadership conversation, and what organizations should do next. All right, so Cash, I want to start with the practical impact of Mythos. A lot of the conversation is focused on the headline, AI can accelerate vulnerability discovery and potentially shorten the path from discovery to exploitation. But for security teams, the bigger issue is what this does to decision making. If vulnerability volume increases, exploitability accelerates, and exposure spans first-party and third-party environments, teams can't rely on the same prioritization methods. The issue is no longer just, can we patch everything fast enough? It's, can we determine which exposures create the most risk and act before they become business disruption? So, Kesh, let's level set on the Mythos moment. What feels different about this moment, and what should security leaders treat as real versus hype? And once you separate the hype from the reality, what does that change about how teams should operate?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia, and thanks to everybody that's joining us here. Great to be with you on the call. I don't think this is hype, although I will say that many of the things that you just mentioned about the pace of vulnerability discovery and the time to exploit shrinking, like these are trends that we've been seeing consistently over the last couple of years, even independent of Mythos and this next generation of models. And for folks that are familiar with the zero-day clock, you've seen the trend from time to exploit shrinking down to basically nothing, where attackers are basically finding and exploiting vulnerabilities before they're publicly known most of the time. The AI tools that attackers now have available to them is just accelerating that even further. And it's not just Mythos, all of the next wave of models have this type of capability, and it'll extend to the open source models as well. And so, people really do need to take it seriously. It is a real problem that companies need to be on top of from a risk standpoint. And I think a couple of the things that you mentioned are totally correct. Like, it won't be feasible to just assume we're going to be able to patch everything, especially when teams struggle to do that already, even without these types of tools in the hands of attackers. And so understanding as much as you can in order to do a more effective job of prioritizing is critical. So a couple of types of context that I think are really important. One is business context, like what is the risk to my organization of this particular supplier of mine, if we're talking about the supply chain. And based on the chat, it seems like a lot of the people here are interested in supply chain, as well as on the sort of first party side of things. What's the importance of this particular asset to my organization, so that I could use that as a factor to how I want to prioritize remediation. And then the other thing that we've seen really good success with inside of our customers is to prioritize based on threat signals as well. And so we actually help customers to understand what the threat activity is around a given vulnerability through what we call a dynamic vulnerability exploit score. And that really helps to cut through the noise, because across a supply chain, you might have tens of thousands of different vulnerability instances that you need to figure out how do you want your vendors to respond to. DVE basically tells you these are the ones that are likely to be attacked over the next 90 days. And so it's not just looking at something static like CVSS, but instead looking at what threat actors are really doing, which vulnerabilities have exploit kits available for them already, and trying to really whittle down to what are just the ones that are likely to be attacked over the near term. And so incorporating those types of factors, the business context and the threat context, I think are really critical in this new world where there's just, an overwhelming number of different things that you need to be aware of, and shrinking your list down to a manageable set is critical to protect the organization.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a great opening when we're thinking about this topic. And Jake, I definitely want to bring you in here too, because this shift from the impact of frontier AI, it's not just that internal security operations preference view. It's also showing up in broader governance and policy conversation.
Yeah.
Executives and boards are increasingly asking whether security teams are making the right trade-offs. Regulators and public sector guidance are also pushing organizations toward more disciplined prioritization. So some interesting developments recently with respect to regulatory focus on AI risk. Recently, the European Central Bank issued an important and unusual letter to large financial institutions, CEOs emphasizing the importance of addressing AI-enabled cyber risk and giving a deadline of October 2026 for a response. Can you help us understand this action and what it means for organizations and just broadly when we're thinking about this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, hello to everybody. This has obviously been a huge topic of interest. So many different elements to it. Glad to be here to share some thoughts too. So I think very clearly the interest across the global regulatory landscape in terms of AI cyber risk has just been massive. And we're just seeing a lot of new legislation emerge on AI risk. We've got these specific warnings from regulators about the cyber risks posed by frontier AI models. In a lot of respects, I think that the regulators are they're acting like board members in a lot of ways. They're asking these sort of important fundamental questions that companies need to answer in order to provide assurance. And some of them, like the ECB, which we're going to talk about, are actually it appears that they're actually providing roadmaps for where they want organizations to move to. So just to pick that ECB letter apart for a little bit, the ECB sends this letter to CEOs of some of the largest, most important financial institutions in the world. And they're asking these same fundamental questions that boards are asking. How is your organization accelerating vulnerability and patching at scale? How are you enhancing your monitoring and detection and AI-enabled defensive capabilities? What are you doing about third-party risk in light of all these critical supply chains? How are you prioritizing the protection of perimeter technologies, internet-facing assets that you have? And and as you mentioned, Olivia, they give this deadline of October for organizations to submit their action plans. So I think that there's a few interesting things that people should be thinking about. One is the ECB, like many other regulators, has been warning about things that they have been seeing that they're concerned about with respect to cybersecurity, but particularly with respect to third-party cyber risk for many years now. The ECB has a thing that they call supervisory priorities, and they publish this every year, sort of announcing like the things that they're going to be focusing on. Well, for the last several years, the things that they're focusing on are third-party risk. So this, to me, is sort of like, okay, the time is now. We're really serious about this. And I think it's going to elicit, a few different reactions from organizations. First of all, for specific European financial institutions that are affected, it means you're going to have a strategy in place to address each of these components. And, there are deadlines and there are progress reports. And, I definitely think this is an area that Bitsight, can help because we do help address a number of these different areas. But for organizations more broadly, I think that this is a great roadmap of how to prioritize some of your thinking with respect to how you as a security leader are going to go about delivering, to your organization some of these capabilities that the boards are sort of asking about. You got to be prepared to answer these questions both to regulators, your investors, your executives, your board, but also your customers. These are the same questions that your customers are going to be asking. And so, I think it's a great roadmap in a lot of respects for organizations to get started on.
Nice. Thanks for that perspective, Jake. Now, we started to talk about the moment, the landscape, some of the regulatory and broader impacts. Let's hone in on risk-based response and what risk-based prioritization looks like in practice. So getting into a bit more of those actionable items. Once teams accept that not every vulnerability can be treated the same, the next question is, what does a better decision model look like? Teams need to understand whether an exposure is exploitable, exposed, being targeted, connected to a critical asset or vendor, and whether action will actually reduce business risk. So, Kesh, I'm curious to hear from you. Do the methods organizations use to assess and monitor cyber risk need to change in this environment? And what does good look like moving forward?
Yeah, so we do see a lot of changes happening across the customers that we talk to. One thing that we've seen in a number of companies is putting actually a task force in place around, kind of Mythos and frontier model readiness. And usually in those cases, what we've seen is a task force that some portion of it is focused on your own infrastructure and assets because your ability to affect change there is greater, and perhaps another group that's focused on the supply chain. One of the other shifts that we're starting to see is specific to the supply chain is more and more security operations and SOC teams taking an interest in the supply chain, especially, this is an obvious one, but like if you have vendors that have VPN access to any of your systems, you may as well think of them as part of your attack surface directly, as well as, companies that are storing PII or PHI, or in the manufacturing space, if you have vendors that are critical to your actual manufacturing process, and if they were to go down with a ransomware attack or something like that, it would shut down your operations or slow them down significantly. We're starting to see that those types of organizations are actually being monitored by the SOC in a lot of cases that want to get alerts to particular exposures, which could be critical vulnerabilities, also could be other types of threats like IAB listings and things like that. But what that really starts to force is better partnership between kind of the governance and business-oriented teams that have context about those vendors with the SOC teams that are taking the more operational response. So usually your TPRM team has the information about which of these vendors are capturing PHI or PII from my organization, or which ones have VPN access. And that needs to be communicated to the SOC who's consuming an alert feed about particular exposures. And then with respect to some of the, risk-based approach that you were mentioning and other types of changes that companies are making to deal with this, again, it comes back to what I was mentioning a little bit before, which is understanding the context around all of these things. And so, in the case of a vulnerability, not all vulnerabilities should be reacted to with the same amount of speed. It depends on, is this an asset that actually matters, or is this some infrastructure that doesn't connect to anything critical within my systems, or isn't responsible for any material business process? Is it actually exploitable? Are threat actors talking about it? So again, it comes back to sort of the business context around it, as well as the threat context around it. Because if it's something that nobody is looking to exploit, then obviously there's less need to remediate. So what we're trying to do and what we're trying to help our customers with is bring all of that context together, the business context about the vendors and about the assets, as well as what we see across the threat landscape, so that you can really pinpoint, these are the places that I need to spend my energy because, it's either an important vendor or an important asset, and it's something that is exploitable and that threat actors are actively targeting right now. And that's what we've found, successful in terms of making the list of work that you need to do more manageable for the teams that you have.
Yeah, I really hear you on that. And, you started to get into one of our other big topics, which is how to think about third parties and the supply chain. And as you kind of just spoke to, Kesh, like Mythos doesn't just, in Frontier AI, doesn't just create a first-party exposure problem. It changes the way organizations need to think about vendors, suppliers, software dependencies, cloud services, APIs, connected infrastructure, like the list can go on. So for many organizations, some of the most material exposure may sit outside their direct control, but still inside their business ecosystem. That means traditional point-in-time assessments are not typically enough. Organizations need continuous visibility into where they're exposed and how that exposure could impact the business. So, Kesh, you were really starting to get into some of these details. Anything else to add? How are practitioners thinking about third parties and supply chains in this new cyber risk environment? What changes when the exposure sits with a vendor, supplier, or connected system outside of their direct control?
Yeah, I mean, so to your point, once a year assessments are definitely not enough in reality. And then you're also starting to see, from a regulatory standpoint, some teeth around that too, like the expectation that companies are not just assessing vendors as, point in time paperwork process, but actually continuously monitoring them to understand their security posture, understand their exposures, and really react to that. And that's what comes back to what I had been mentioning, which is that there is a fairly heavy operational component to this as well, which we're starting to see security ops and SOC teams start to pick up inside of organizations, where what you need to do that effectively is, first of all, that mapping of the context. So kind of combining the information that a TPRM team has about what do each of these vendors do? What are they responsible for? Which of my data do they have? What access to my systems do they have? Combining that and bringing it over to the operational teams who are equipped to deal with alerts, triage them and respond accordingly. And so depending on the context of a vendor, if you get an alert that they have a critical exposure or that they might be actively compromised, then you start to see steps getting taken like, okay, let's disconnect all of our systems from this vendor so that the compromise doesn't extend into our environment. And then let's be proactive and reach out to this vendor to make sure that they're actually doing something to address it. Because in a lot of cases, that vendor may not be aware of the same either intelligence or exposure information that you have. Um, and then we also see a real need to get ahead of these vulnerabilities when they come up. So one of the things that Bitsight's been investing in for a long time and has actually increased our investment and improved our approach substantially using AI is fingerprinting all of the different products that companies are using across their infrastructure so that we can very, very quickly give visibility when a new vulnerability is discovered in any of those products, where that exists across the internet and in your supply chain specifically. Usually it's the case that there's not enough time to like run a vulnerability scan for these types of issues when they come up when they're really hot. And so Bitsight's approach is, well, let's just fingerprint all of the products across the internet as a starting point. And then once a vulnerability is known in a product, you can see exactly where that lives across your own infrastructure and your supply chain. And we think that is the way that companies will be able to stay ahead as the time to exploit continues to shrink between vulnerability discovery and exploitation.
Mm-hmm. What I really like about what you just said too is it makes me think of that like a sense of partnership and acting as another resource to be able to share information all in the effort to help all of us, which I think is great. So Jake, I'm also interested for your perspective on this topic because I know the extended ecosystem, supply chain, it's really top of mind for a lot of security practitioners out there.
Yeah, well, and just to build off of what Kesh was just saying and what you were just saying, Olivia, I mean, when you think of what AI is doing to transform security programs, I mean, it is like having being able to take advantage of new bodies, new expertise, quicker ways of doing things, automation, et cetera, without necessarily having to go out and add headcount and things like that. So I mean, to do a lot more inside of your security program, leveraging AI and automation, I mean, is kind of where all of this is heading anyway. And so I think that has to be on the minds of security leaders when we think about third-party risk, which is traditionally a really sort of like underappreciated focus of the security program anyway. So I think that there's a couple points that I just want to make about TPRM. First of all, I don't think there's any question that this is a fundamental change for TPRM programs. When I look across our customer base and the customers that we're talking to and some of the other conversations we're having in the market, I'm seeing generally speaking, organizations sort of focusing in a few specific areas. One is they're focusing on this idea of AI specific vendor ratings. This idea of like can we build some sort of scorecard to identify our most critical vendors based on business criticality, their security performance, and specifically some of the AI related questions that they're asking about AI contract requirements or use of AI in products, things of that nature. So I'm seeing a focus by organizations to kind of like wrap their arms around like the AI risk for their vendors. So I'm seeing that's an important area. And by the way, I would point out to everybody that some of the Bitsight analytics that have historically given insight into things like vulnerability management, like patching cadence and others, are exactly built for this purpose. I mean, we should totally turn to those types of analytics to get a sense for third-party organizational performance in vulnerability management, because that's exactly what they're going to have to do in this new world. I think that the DVE score that Kesh mentioned, which is that dynamic vulnerability score where we sort of assess threat actor likelihood of exploiting a vulnerability, is another one that's really important. So I think that that's a good overlay for these AI specific third-party ratings. The second thing that I'm seeing across the customer base is a lot of focus on contractual changes or contract enforcement as like a major issue. And so when you think about it, a lot of organizations, have general requirements for their third parties or vendors to like have a security program, but they don't necessarily mandate accelerated remediation timelines or require evidence of vulnerability remediation or things of that nature. And I think that that's going to change. I mean, so Bitsight is providing data and insights into how your third parties are doing and how quickly they're remediating things. But I think that Mythos is probably forcing a bigger examination of the effectiveness of our contractual mechanisms and what needs to change and what do we need to add and should we change our expectations for third parties. So that's the second thing. The third thing that I think we're seeing and we should expect to see a lot more of is the vendor engagement, third-party engagement. And it's related to that contracts discussion. I think the level of engagement is going to go way, way up between organizations and their supply chain. We're already seeing a lot of this. We're gonna see this accelerated, I think, a lot more questions. We're going to see more automation, more engagement, again, as organizations are thinking about or rethinking about the engagement level that they have with their third parties. And that kind of leads me to the last thing that I think is going to change significantly in the years ahead, which is more of that automated decision-making. And Kesh sort of alluded to this, which is, how can, Bitsight data, for example, inform me about the status of my digital ecosystem? How can it inform my own internal models that are going to allow me to make control changes when it comes to like Kesh talked about, the VPN access or the API access, or how do I eliminate or slow down the rate of data exchange between vendors, or how can I disintegrate myself from some of my vendors depending on what I'm seeing with respect to their performance in certain areas. So I think that is going to be a major area of focus. And again, AI is going to enable a lot of those things to take place.
Thank you both for your comprehensive, thoughts on that topic. I do know it's a really important one. Now, I'm going to move us forward to a discussion related to turning prioritization into a leadership conversation. So, Jake, I want to shift to the leadership side of this. In this high velocity environment, we've already talked about how security teams can't treat every exposure the same. They have to make decisions about what requires immediate action, what needs mitigation, what should be monitored, and where executive support or investment may be needed. And that can be really hard to communicate.
Yeah.
Execs and boards, they don't need every technical detail, but they do need to trust the logic behind the priorities. So the key message isn't we're doing less, it's we're applying a disciplined model to focus resources where they'll reduce the most meaningful risk. So, Jake, when security teams are prioritizing some risks over others, what does leadership need to understand in order to trust the decision?
Yeah, so definitely don't say you're doing less. I think that's that would be a piece of advice number one. But you're totally right, Olivia. I mean, there's I guess the way that I'm thinking about this is if you're a security leader, you've got to be able to on the one hand articulate your work to executives and the board about all the changes that you're implementing in your program. And on the other hand, you're going to need to show, the metrics and, changes in effectiveness and preparedness and resilience and all these other things from a quantitative, measurement perspective. So let me start with the first, and I'll move to the second. So I want to touch on what Kesh was talking about, this task force model, because I think it's really important. So we are seeing a lot of customers using this task force model to deal with the various security issues that are associated with these frontier AI models. And, I like this because having a task force or having a committee can help prioritize things collectively, and that can really help security leaders communicate these things more effectively. So when you think about a task force or a committee, what you're really thinking about is you've got named owners, you've got defined lanes, you have no ambiguity about who is accountable across different work streams. And, typically these things are involving more than just the security team. It's, security and ops. And, obviously we talked about GRC and IT and product teams and others. Some of the most common work streams that we have seen with respect to Mythos related conversations are about vulnerability management, integrating threat intelligence into the program for prioritization purposes, network segmentation, and of course third party supply chain risk, which we've been discussing. Interestingly, a lot of those things are a focus of the ECB letter that we talked about earlier. But I think that those work streams are really important because of the responsibility and accountability that they create. And so, I would just say, like, having spent some time over the years in the world of vulnerability management, one of the biggest problems that we have there is that security leaders don't necessarily own the fixes for vulnerabilities. So you've got security teams that are finding a bunch of vulnerabilities or finding code issues, but they're not necessarily the group that fixes it. The reality is that falls on other people in other parts of the building or folks who are selling the product. So a key question is, how do we create an accountability model that is going to extend for the entire organization? What should we be focusing on? Should we focus on KEVs? How do we think about threat intel informing the decision making? All of those things are really important conversations that I really think that those kind of task force work streams can really help address. And then the second major issue is the metrics that are going to describe the effectiveness of the program. And so if you're a security leader, you're presenting the metrics of the effectiveness, the readiness. The reality is that your organization is going to get attacked 1,000 different ways, a million times a day. So how do I show from a detection and defense and response and recovery standpoint that we're doing things in a different way, with respect to vulnerability management, remediation timelines, and things like that. And certainly I think that there are a number of different metrics that Bitsight has from an analytical perspective that can support some of those things, some of those conversations that that security leaders are having with the executive team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I really appreciate those thoughts. Now, I'm going to have us go through just one more section because we have a lot of great questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. So as we wrap up, I want to make this practical. Frontier AI, Mythos, doesn't mean that security teams need to panic, right? It means security teams need to make better, faster, and more defensible decisions. So the organizations that are likely best prepared are going to be the ones that can see their exposure clearly, prioritize based on threat and business context, act faster across their extended ecosystem, and explain their trade-offs with confidence. So, Cash, I'd like to start with you. If a security leader wants to make their team's response more risk-based and defensible in the next 30 days, assuming that teams are already working and aware of this, what are a couple of key things they should make sure they're doing?
Yeah, I guess I would start by highlighting one of the things that you said. It's like, it's not I wouldn't suggest like panic and change everything, right? Because many of the trends and the expectations that we have about how the world is going to evolve post this next generation of models, kind of an acceleration of what we've been seeing for a while. And, a lot of the best practices against the next generation of models are very similar to the best practices prior to the models. You just have to be, rigorous and disciplined about them. But a couple things I would suggest. One is making sure that you have the visibility that you need. That's kind of step one. And when I say that, I mean, across your own attack surface, like we're seeing a lot of increased interest just in general external attack surface management. Like I need to understand what my perimeter looks like from the outside. I need to make sure that new assets that are spun up, I get visibility into those. I need to see that. And then, coverage across the supply chain as well, which is something that, a lot of companies, they may have a, sort of a limited view of their supply chain, maybe just looking at a couple of vendors closely, but not all of them, making sure that you have strong visibility into what the posture, the performance, and the exposure of your suppliers actually is, which isn't, that difficult to do. There's many different tools out there and available. Sometimes it just requires good implementation of the tools. And then, thinking about how you want to set up the structure for prioritization. And we mentioned a couple of ways to do that, including the business context, including the threat context. But I would say it doesn't necessarily mean the organization needs to take a totally different shape from how it is today, but it does require some concerted effort to make sure that you have the right visibility across the extended attack surface and a good mechanism for prioritizing, and then also good collaboration between the different teams. And that's a place where you often see things fall through the cracks as, different teams have a different view of what everybody is going to be doing or responsible for. And so the better communication and collaboration that you have, especially between your kind of governance aligned teams and your operational teams, the more effective you can be and the better use of everybody's knowledge you can make.
Thanks for that, Kesh. Jake, I'll turn it over to you. What would you add to that for the group?
I think those are all great. I'm thinking of just some of the things that we sort of talked about. I really like the idea of the internal committee or internal task force, and so I'm sure a lot of folks on the call have one of those, and if you don't, maybe think about creating one. But I love it because it gets to that, accountability issue, kind of the shared responsibility model. And I also think it's a great way of, kind of getting your security team, sort of more involved, more connected with, other parts of the business, which I think is, is something that's really important, as Kesh alluded to. So number one, I really like that idea of the internal task force or, internal, commission to focus on this. The second thing I would actually try to do is I would try to answer some of those ECB questions. Again, the ECB document does not apply to every organization in the world. It's written for a certain number of European financial institutions, but in a lot of respects, I think that those are the essential fundamental questions that every organization around the world with a board of directors needs to be able to answer. About things that we've talked about: third-party risk, internet exposure, vulnerability remediation, and prioritization. And so I would spend over the next few weeks time trying to see what our answers to those questions would be. Do we like the answers to those questions? Where do we feel more or less confident in? And then how can we take the time to address some of those gaps that we perceive? So I like that as just kind of like a number two, think about ECB questions. And then the third thing, kind of what Kesh was saying too, is we've always thought that third-party programs, the supply chain risk programs, have been underdeveloped over the years. Kesh sort of mentioned the number of organizations that we see continuously monitoring the majority of their vendors very, very low. And so I really don't think, even from the best organizations, I really don't think that folks really have a super strong grasp on what is actually happening with respect to their critical third-party suppliers and vendors. And so I would really try to focus on that. I would spend some time, asking some of those key AI questions, hey, how, what do the patching rates look like? What's the vulnerability remediation rate look like? What have these organizations shared back with us about, their approach to AI, how they're using AI models, et cetera? What's the business impact if one of these vendors goes down or is disrupted? And so I would really kind of, start thinking more broadly about how to build out that third-party supply chain risk management program, because I'm going to be asked a lot of questions about that, whether it's from my regulators, from my customers, from my board. And so I want to spend some time thinking about that.
Great. Kesh, Jake, really appreciate the thoughts, perspective. To close out this discussion, I'll bring us back to 3 takeaways. So first, what we've heard us talk about, you can't treat every vulnerability the same. So the volume and velocity are too high for flat severity-only prioritization. Second, risk-based response depends on context. Teams need to know what's exposed, what's exploitable, what's being targeted, what matters to the business, where action will reduce meaningful risk. We're seeing it apply broadly in terms of regulations and mandates that are being introduced. And third, prioritization has to be defensible. Executives and boards need to understand what's being addressed, what's being sequenced, why, kind of speaking in that shared language. So a big takeaway after Mythos, Frontier AI, the organizations best positioned will not be the ones trying to fix everything at once. It's the ones who can identify what matters most, act with evidence, show measurable progress over time, both for their own company and their supply chain, the vendors ecosystem you work with. All right. With that, we're going to
Sounds easy, Olivia.
Oh, I know. So easy. With that, we'll transition to Q&A. So I'm looking through. There was an interesting question asked towards the beginning of the session. What do you think regulations on AI are going to look like, state by state, and then the burden imposed by that, or on a federal level? Asking about the U.S. specifically.
What a super question. And maybe we should ask an AI model to predict it for us. I would say, generally speaking, what we're seeing is efforts for more aggressive AI-focused regulation in the states, and a little bit more of a hands-off approach by the federal government here in the United States. And I'm not sure how long that will last. Obviously, there's just a lot of politics for those who are sort of following this too. Just a lot of politics involved in the AI debate as well. And so when I compare, when I think about what's happening today versus what might happen a year from now or 2 years from now here in the United States, it's really hard to predict, because I absolutely think that there could be, we could go in a number of different ways. There could be different backlashes against certain models that push us in one direction or another. There could be what I expect to be a pretty bad couple of years, quite frankly, with respect to exploitation and risk, which I think a lot of you are like gearing up for right now, and that could sort of change the dynamic here in the U.S. So there are a lot of things to consider. What I will also say is that other regions are approaching this in different ways, right? I mean, so we are seeing EMEA and APAC, for example, being much more sort of forward-leaning on the regulatory aspects of this, which is kind of traditionally, I think, how some of the cybersecurity stuff is sort of broken down too. So, sorry for not having a great a decisive one way or the other take on it, but I think it's really still up in the air.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair. All right, we've got another question. Does Bitsight provide an open source AI tool for organizations to perform a periodic vulnerability assessment? Kesh, I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah, so inside of our products, we do have modules for vulnerability prioritization. So there's a capability in both our security posture management product as well as our continuous third-party monitoring product. Both of those give you visibility into vulnerabilities that we've found on organizations. Inside of the SPM product, this is related to your own organization's attack surface, so vulnerabilities that we've found on your assets. And then in the third-party product, this is obviously related to your supply chain. Importantly, in the third-party product, it's, you can group by vulnerabilities, and so you can easily see for a particular vulnerability that you might be concerned about, let's say because it has a very high potential exploit score, you can see all of the impacted vendors of yours where we've seen that vulnerability on their attack surface. And then it also has workflow associated with it where you can, at scale, reach out to those vendors and ask them to remediate and follow up with what they're doing in terms of remediation activity. So both of those are available inside of our products.
Thanks, Kesh. I'm seeing multiple questions as well, specifically related to ECB. So, Jake, Kesh, I don't know if you have a best, like how to help people. They're looking for the ECB questionnaire and being able to see kind of, Jake, what you were saying about it's a great guide to that task force and approach. I know. Oh, and you just put a link. You put a link.
I just stuck a link in there. Folks should totally, totally read this. Again, even if you're not a European financial institution, it's worth a read. It's short and sort of easy to understand.
Yeah. I know we're putting together a resource on the Bitsight side that helps people understand how we can essentially help in these different areas. So I'll take a note that I can look to send that out with this recording just as another resource for people to look at. Okay, let me see. All right. Someone asked, we're getting pressure to govern AI, but we don't still have a great view of where AI tools are being used across the business or by vendors. Where would you recommend starting?
Yeah, so that is a place where Bitsight has also put a good amount of investment over the last several quarters. We think of it as the AI attack surface. So just like supply chains continue to expand and add risk to businesses, we see what happens inside of a lot of companies is there's a ton of pressure, usually from the executive level down, like innovate using AI, automate using AI, being pushed into the teams. Which to some extent makes sense, but then it's really hard to put good governance in place around all of the AI technologies that are being used and experimented with. And so you see a lot of things happening, like people spinning up AI services and not putting any kind of security controls on them, or spinning them up and forgetting to take them down. So some examples of the types of detections Bitsight has around this. One is exposed MCP servers, where we've actually found quite a few MCP servers that are totally unauthenticated, and anybody or any agent can just show up to them and ask for all of the data that that MCP has access to, and it'll comply. So we provide visibility into that type of exposure. OpenClaw was a protocol that I'm sure most people are familiar with. Just boomed in popularity back at the beginning of this year, and we can detect instances of that across corporate networks. And then also kind of like AI components, a good example being AI gateways. There was a pretty notable compromise in an AI gateway. This is like a tool that routes queries to different types of models that people might want to use. We have visibility into those as well. And in the case of the compromise, we issued a major security event that gave our customers easy ability to see where that particular gateway was used on their own attack surface and in their supply chain so that they could drive remediation. So there is actually quite a bit of detection that Bitsight has on this, and you can find it both in our SPM product, in our attack surface analytics, and then in our continuous monitoring product for supply chain. We have a whole new dashboard card that gives you visibility into any of the AI technologies that are used across your supply chain.
Kesh, the flip side to that too is that I think we're also seeing a lot of organizations still using the old-fashioned method of asking questions of their vendors, right? And getting those responses about how are you using AI? How are the models affecting the products that you're providing to us? So we still see that as an important series of questions that organizations are asking of their third-party suppliers, and that also should inform the types of the language that you might want to consider in your contracts or amendments that you might want to make and things of that nature. So there's a couple different ways of going about it.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Kesh, for answering. I was just about to bring up Vince's point in the chat. Okay. Ooh, all right. What do you do with a vendor who doesn't engage with a response when confronted with a vulnerability or exposure?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it depends a bit on your relationship with that vendor. And this is where I think it highlights the need for collaboration between operations and GRC teams. Like usually we see in our customers that TPRM teams, which are often GRC aligned, have the relationship with the vendor and also the context about what that vendor is doing for you, and maybe relationship to the business sponsor as well. So depending on your relationship and what they're doing for you, like your options may change in terms of what makes sense to do. There are certain things that are in your control and then certain things that aren't in your control. If you're very concerned about it, obviously good options are making sure that you don't have any kind of system connection to that particular vendor if you're worried about compromise. And then it's really a business decision downstream of that. Like if this is something that you're that concerned about, you could choose to find a different vendor to work with if they're not complying with your security expectations. There's different options, but again, it kind of ends up turning into a conversation between the risk team, the business sponsor for that particular vendor, and then understanding what the vendor is doing for you and what your other options are outside of them.
Okay, that's great. And I think we have time for one more question. I just saw this one. I think it's pretty interesting. Can the SPM and VRA data be accessed through the API if the customer wants to build a custom dashboard and aggregate with other data? Kesh, are you interested in speaking to that one?
Just trying to understand it better. Is that one of the ones in the chat, Olivia?
It's one of the ones in the Q&A. It's Greg. Greg, feel free to clarify. I was kind of thinking, like, are you asking about, something like related to AI and pulling in data to tools, or is this something different? If we're not sure, we can hold on it. Okay.
Can you just, I can't see it in the chat, but can you just ask the question again, Olivia?
Of course. So for example, can SPM data be accessed through the API if a customer wanted to build a custom dashboard, aggregate with other data? And Greg clarified it's pulling data from Bitsight to other platforms.
Yeah, for sure. So we have APIs around our products. The capability that's maybe even more interesting in this regard is we've built MCP interfaces around our products, and a lot of our customers are starting to have great success pulling Bitsight data into their AI environments, whether that's Claude or Copilot or other places, and then that can be a good location to also combine Bitsight data with other data sets. We see that a lot in the vulnerability management space. And we're really excited about MCP especially because that is opening up new doors in terms of what customers are able to do with the very extensive data set that Bitsight has. So our MCP interfaces are available. They're in early access. So if you're interested, just reach out to your account team and we can get you into our early access program. And we'd love to hear what you're looking to do to use our data inside of your AI tools.
That's great. Okay. All right. I want to say another thank you to Kesh and Jake. Great conversation. I really appreciate the audience, awesome engagement and questions. And we'll be sure to send different resources, the recording, and please, follow up through. If you're currently a customer, your account management team, we're happy to always try and get you more information. All right. With that, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, great rest of the week. Thank you.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody.